So tomorrow is Halloween, which I feel is an extremely underrated Christian holiday. This feeling is partly rooted in the liturgical history of All Hallows Eve and the way that it feeds into All Saints and All Souls as part of our annual 3-day Christian journey into our relationship with the dead. But I also mean, when I say it's an underrated Christian holiday, that there is something intensely Christian about a holiday which uses weird stories and disturbing imagery to gather community and turn strangers into neighbors, all facilitated by a spirit of open-handed generosity. So, this year, when a witch or a skeleton or Wonder Woman or Buzz Lightyear turns up on your front doorstep expecting candy from you, simply because the two of you are neighbors, reflect on how amazing that is. It's a wonderful night of the year. For this reason, I love to preach Halloween sermons. There's a lot you can work with: spirits and neighborliness and tradition, generosity, and perhaps most importantly to me, a chance to talk about spooky stories in church. Because the Christian tradition actually has a ton of spooky content. And it's great to have a day on the calendar where we can make it our purpose to talk about it. So I had all of this in mind when I asked Martin about a month ago if I could preach on October 30th. He very kindly said yes. And then I actually read the gospel reading for today. The story of Zacchaeus. Could anything be less scary? So if you're unfamiliar with the story of Zacchaeus, it is a Sunday school classic. Maybe not as well known as Noah's Ark or Jonah and the Whale, but still, it's a crowd pleaser for the little ones. I mean, I grew up singing a children's song in church. I wonder if anybody else encountered this, about Zacchaeus, which described him as, quote, "a wee little man, and a wee little man was he," unquote. It had hand motions. It was awesome. So the story has long been embraced as a great pick for the kids because it features this small, curious, tree-climbing figure who works as a natural stand-in for a child's own experience. It's kind of adorable. The problem with this cutesy reading is that it misses some of what actually seems to be happening in the story. When you start to do some meaningful Bible study on the characters and the setting of our tale, you actually find that it can have a much darker edge than you might expect, which is great for me because I'm right back to having a worthy Halloween sermon. So today I want to tell you a story. I want to tell you that lurking behind the cute Zacchaeus tale, you can find an ancient supernatural curse which preys upon children. Today I want to tell you about the curse of Jericho. In fact, if I had a title for this Halloween sermon special, it would be The Curse of Jericho, probably in like red blood-drippy letters with bats fluttering all around it. Maybe Evelyn can do something in post-production. We'll see. So Jericho is the city where our gospel text tells us the Zacchaeus story takes place. The curse of Jericho begins about 2,000 years before the time of Jesus. We first encounter Jericho in the Bible as the site of the Israelites' first battle when they enter the Promised Land. You can find the story of that battle in Joshua chapter 6, where the Israelites march round and round the city until God miraculously makes the walls come tumbling down, and then the city is stormed. Whenever we occasionally tell that story in church, we usually rush past how Joshua chapter 6 ends, with the utter annihilation of the population of Jericho, followed by Joshua pronouncing a curse upon the city's ruins. In Joshua 6:26, you can actually read the curse. It says that anyone who attempts to rebuild this city will do so at the cost of their firstborn child when they lay the foundation, and at the cost of their youngest child when they finish the gates. That is an ancient way of saying you lose one child when you start the city building and another when you finish. And the fact that this curse specifies the oldest and youngest child may imply that you lose all your other children over the course of rebuilding. The idea behind this disturbing tale of massacre and curse seems to have been something like this. Jericho was understood as the locked door against the Israelites entering the Promised Land. And once it was gone, there was never again to be such a symbol separating Israel from the land. The kingdom of Israel was to endure forever, and Jericho was to remain a ruin forever. And yet, Jericho exists today. There's about 18,000 people living there in the West Bank as we speak. We can see in our gospel lesson that Jericho had already come back into existence in Jesus' time. So, who rebuilt it? And what about the creepy curse? To find that answer, you have to flip over to 1 Kings 16:34. For centuries after Joshua's conquest, Jericho did lay in ruins, we are told. Yet in the time of King Ahab of Israel, probably the most iconic wicked king in Israelites' long history of wicked kings, we are told that a guy named Hiel of Bethel rebuilds Jericho. We don't get much information about Hiel, but it's easy to see why he would be interested in this particular rebuilding project. Jericho was ideally situated to be both an agricultural and a commercial center. Archaeology tells us that folks have lived there essentially since the dawn of human civilization, at least going back to 10,000 BCE. It is a choice bit of real estate. So Hiel seems to have said, I fear no curse, and especially no curse which forces me to leave a ton of money on the table. I'm going to rebuild that place. We have to imagine that Hiel of Bethel was remembered in Zacchaeus' time as a major figure, the founding father, or at least the refounding father of Jericho. The guy with enough guts and tenacity to bring a city back from the dead. Zacchaeus probably grew up hearing the legend of his city's refounding, as recorded briefly in 1 Kings 16:34. Now let me tell you, it's a striking little tale. Here's what it says. As Hiel lays the last stone of the city's new foundations, we are told that his oldest son, Abiram, dies. And when he reaches the final stage of rebuilding the city and he sets up the gates, he does so at the cost of his youngest son, Segub. The text tells us that these sons are victims of Joshua's ancient curse. So Zacchaeus and all the other kids of Jericho grow up hearing this story as emblematic of what it means to be a Jerichoite. Imagine the implications of frequently hearing that story. This is a story that tells us Hiel, the city's great founder, was the sort of guy who loses his eldest son to a well-known curse at the outset of his project and then keeps on building. Imagine the looks that Hiel must have exchanged with Segub as construction moved towards the gates. Hiel refused to have his ambition for power and wealth blunted by the suffering of others, not even his own children. That legend becomes part of what it means to be a child of Jericho, what it meant to be a person of strength in Jericho. The other famous spot where Jericho gets a mention in the Bible is found earlier in Luke's gospel in the parable of the Good Samaritan. There we are told that the unnamed victim who gets robbed and beaten and left to die in a ditch suffers that fate on the road leading down to Jericho. There's an implication in the Good Samaritan story that stuff like this is kind of what you expect when you're heading down to Jericho. It's a dangerous road to a dangerous place. Jericho is a town where folks keep on building their riches, even if it costs an innocent life or two. It's a region where the weak are eaten by the strong, and this, we have to imagine, is kind of a big problem for Zacchaeus, because he is physically just about the least intimidating guy you could meet. Our story makes a note of telling us that he is short in stature. Far from being a cute little detail, we are likely being told that Zacchaeus lives with what modern science would call dwarfism. The scholar Michael Parsons has made a deep study of ancient ways of writing about disability, and he's convinced that the way Luke writes here is part of a distinctive pattern in Luke's writing, where he repeatedly calls attention to figures with physical disability who encounter Jesus. We can imagine that growing up disabled in a town like Jericho, Zacchaeus probably grew up being mocked, ostracized, and told that he or his parents were being punished by God. In fact, we may hear an echo of that in the story when people say to Jesus, "Why do you want to eat with this sinner?" It's not hard to imagine why a kid who has already endured such treatment and who has already been made to be an outcast would be drawn towards the unsavory trade of tax collecting for the Romans. If you're going to be an outcast, why not profit from it? He had learned the lesson of the curse of Jericho. Focus on self-interest or be sacrificed for somebody else's good. I imagine that every time Zacchaeus demanded payment from a childhood bully, he felt a sense of renewed power. Who's laughing now, buddy? I mean, we're told that Zacchaeus is not just any tax collector. He's a chief tax collector. He's one of the best. He's rich and powerful. He probably tosses a few shekels to the temple every so often just to make sure he's good with God. But business is business, and business can be rough. You can't get distracted by suffering when you're laying the foundations of something great. You just need to keep on building. You show your strength. That's the Jericho way. And then, one day, into all of this backstory, walks Jesus. Zacchaeus has heard of this guerrilla rabbi from up in Nazareth. He's heard that Jesus' teaching is different, powerful somehow. And when Zacchaeus finally pulls himself up into that tree and gets an earful of what Jesus is saying, he nearly falls back down. See, Zacchaeus has never forgotten his life as a kid. As much as he tries to forget it, he remembers it like it was yesterday. He remembers being ridiculed and taunted as the runt of Jericho. He remembers when the big kids would impersonate his unbalanced walk of his shorter legs and then just laugh and laugh. And now he hears this rabbi saying that those who are outcasts, those who are mocked and belittled, that these people are the beloved of God. He hears this rabbi say that God is not on the side of the strong, the mighty, the bullies. The God of Israel, says Jesus, is the God of the weak and the despised. There's nothing we can do to prove our value to this God, because in the eyes of this God, we are already of infinite worth. All of us. Hiel, the founding father of Jericho, was wrong. Strength does not look like stepping over the corpses of the weak to get what you want. It does not look like numbing yourself against the suffering of others. Joshua was wrong. The God of Israel does not demand massacre and brutality towards those he despises, because there are no people God despises. The God of Israel does not sacrifice others. God, according to this wandering teacher from backwater Galilee, is the kind of God who offers himself as a sacrifice for others. Remember that the guy Zacchaeus is listening to from up in that sycamore tree would not have been known to him by the Greek name Jesus. Zacchaeus was instead listening to a teacher with the Hebrew name Yeshua, Joshua. A new Joshua had come to Jericho. And this Joshua did not come with death and a curse, but with life and a blessing. Blessed are you who have been told that God does not care about you, for you are the children of God. That is what I imagine Jesus is teaching in the streets right before he looks up into the sycamore tree and tells Zacchaeus that he wants to have dinner at his house. That of all the possible souls in Jericho who could enjoy the honor of hosting this visiting rabbi, Jesus chooses Zacchaeus. I imagine Zacchaeus is still chewing on this new understanding of God later that evening when he's laughing and eating with Jesus back at home. Food is being passed around the table, wine is flowing, one of Jesus' eccentric disciples is laughing a little too loudly in the next room. I imagine the full meaning of Jesus' teaching hits Zacchaeus in waves. And then he starts declaring that he will give away half his wealth. No, more than that. He will actually give back 4 times whatever he took from anyone he has ever cheated. It's a strange version of Halloween night at Zacchaeus' home, and he's practicing that open-handed generosity that I mentioned earlier. He is giving stuff away simply because he knows he is neighbors with the people of Jericho, and that is reason enough. And the more of his carefully accumulated wealth that he gives away, the more Zacchaeus feels something losing its grip on him. He feels the curse of Jericho breaking. Zacchaeus doesn't have to prove that he is strong enough, that he's in charge enough, that he has value and power and worth, because would you just look at all the stuff I have? He is freed from the bottomless need to prove himself because he knows he is loved. Unlike Hiel of Bethel, Zacchaeus can stop building when he sees he is laying the foundations of suffering for others. Salvation has come to Zacchaeus' house. May we likewise learn that strength and kindness are not opposing forces. May we likewise learn the power of generosity to free us from finding our value in our possessions. May we likewise learn that we are always absolutely loved beyond all measure, and so is everybody else. May we likewise break the curse of Jericho. Happy Halloween.